I think what hopefully we can do is try and talk about this from the point of view, because we've got, I think most of us, we've got heritage from before getting involved in mobile. I know Bill and I actually crossed paths, but without actually meeting each other. I used to work at NVIDIA when the Tegra chip was being imagined, and Bill was there at the time, and came up with the. I think it was you who came up with that term, wasn't it? The way it's meant to be played. So what I'm going to do is let's just get started by asking each of you to introduce yourself. Christian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Christian Allen. I'm the Unreal Evangelist for North America for Epic Games. So I spend my time evangelizing the Unreal Engine and explaining to people what an evangelist does.
Yeah, I know that problem. I'm not an evangelist anymore, though. Bill, I kind of stole the headline, but yeah, go for it.
I'm Bill Rehbock, had been head of developer relations at NVIDIA for 15 years, VP of R&D at Sony Computer Entertainment during the PlayStation 1 days. Did create the Way It's Meant to Be Played program, which was, at the end of the day, all about recognizing the fact that NVIDIA's graphics cards made for really, really good doorstops without having the backing of the developer community and publishers making great games for it.
Dave.
My name's Dave Rohrl. You can't spell or pronounce my last name. Don't try. Been making games for about 25 years now, beginning at the Learning Company, Pogo, PopCap, Zynga, played them here, there, everywhere. For the last 4 years or so, I've been operating a small consulting company that I founded called Mobile Game Doctor. We work with developers all over the world, mostly mobile, mostly free to play, helping get games back on track, filling in for missing design resources, and generally solving thorny creative problems.
So let's kick off. So we're talking about mobile at this stage, but it is a wider question than mobile. But let's start with, in the mobile space, what's exciting you? I mean, obviously we've got an elephant in the room we will talk about at some point. But in principle, with Fortnite aside, what do you think is kind of the really thing that's excited you?
Yeah, so with the mobile space, and I should touch on my background as well. So I came from AAA. I started in the late 90s. I was creative director on the Ghost Recon franchise on Xbox at Ubisoft. I was design lead on Halo Reach at Bungie. I was at Warner Brothers on Mad Max and Lord of the Rings, and then I ran my own studio for 5 years, shipping Unreal games. So that's my quick background. What's exciting to me on mobile really is through the evolution of the power of the devices and the evolution of the technology that people are using to create games on those devices is really the fundamental integration of the mobile games into the traditional game development pipeline. So this concept moving forward that you don't need to make your quote-unquote AAA game and then later split off and have your sub-team do, or alternate team or contract team do the quote-unquote mobile version that's generally a completely separate game, a completely separate pipeline, completely separate assets. That fundamentally changes from a development aspects the mobile game outlook. And I think we saw a very similar evolution in console development where in the early 2000s, you didn't co-develop a PC game and a console game because they were so fundamentally different in the architecture and how you developed them. You either had a separate team, you had to pick your lead SKU, and your lead SKU was generally going to be really good, and maybe the other SKUs would be okay, maybe. I think for me as a developer, having worked across on console, PC, and some mobile, that's the fundamental shift that I see.
But one of the things that always strikes me in that space is, I mean, again, we're going to come back to this with Fortnite, but is the mode of use of the device still plays a factor. So as much, with PC and console, that differentiation, they were still going to either our den or the front room, but essentially it was setting aside space and time to dedicate a number of hours to play. Whereas mobile mode of use is more, I'm here now, I play now, in general. Do you see that being a factor?
Yeah, It's definitely a factor. I mean, you have to think about how your player is or user is going to interact with the application. But again, I think that's just an evolution, right? When we moved over to console, one of the fundamental shifts that we had to accept early on was that the user might not necessarily know how to use a game controller. On PC, you could always assume, at least in my lifetime in games, that the user knew how to use a keyboard and mouse. You could make that assumption. You could make the assumption that they were sitting down. You could make the assumption that they had booted up their PC and opened your application. So we had to make fundamental shifts on console. For example, time to gameplay was fundamental on Xbox, that from the time someone stuck that disc into the game, they had to be playing in just a couple minutes, and they had to be into multiplayer matches in just a couple minutes. And that's a similar shift that you have to make. And now all those things are assumed. That's just standard development.
Now it's a couple of seconds.
Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say, as a guy who's been building, web, mobile, Facebook for decades, right? The idea that you can start playing in just a couple of minutes just breaks my brain.
Exactly.
Does not compute.
Yeah. Shows. Yeah. But I think knowing just knowing that same approach when it comes to any device, I think the fundamental win of the Switch is one that really we see it just really grabs the users right away, and it's from the physical design of the device and how it looks to how players are experiencing it, it just resonated across.
You have no idea of how many years of waiting for that thing to happen. We had back in the Tegra days, we were talking about this stuff so early on, and it would never happen. And then now suddenly the Switch is here. It's like, oh my god! But
speaking of Fortnite on Switch,
we'll get. That's the next question. Bill, let's stick with the kind of evolution.
Let's make some news.
Let's stick with the exciting stuff. As in what's excited you. I do remember though one thing I wanted to add was even back in the 2006-7 or whatever, we were looking at people's use of mobile phones, particularly at the time there was a big push for TV on your phone, which obviously never really happened. And we did some studies where we saw that most people using their phone to do that were sat next to their other half in the living room.
Right.
I don't know if you were part of those conversations, but is this the? Was I being overly concerned about the idea of somebody being on the toilet or needing that moment? Are we actually, are these devices now so mainstream that it doesn't really matter in terms of the content that they're playing?
I think that at this point in time, the interesting thing about mobile devices is that we are now past the panic of fragmentation for the most part, and people are realizing that with engines like Unreal and others, that it's really kind of okay to build a game for the highest end devices and get your money shot, right? Make sure that your game looks gorgeous. Make sure work with Samsung or whoever to HTC, et cetera, to make sure that the reviewers have the device that you want your game seen on, right? That's like big number one, and that is a huge learning of NVIDIA and graphics cards for now 30 years, right? But it's also okay to put the fallbacks in the game and back off the effects and everything else. And now that the developers have done a better job of wrapping their brain around that paradigm, now we're seeing games that look good and reward people for having better hardware, but are doing their numbers and are hitting a mass market kind of chord that is really, really great to see.
And we were talking about the chipsets catching up with console platforms more than 10 years ago, and they kind of have to a certain extent.
I kind of disagree with that. So Mark Rain and I were on a panel many years ago with what's his face, Neil from EA, who wanted to say that as long as you were spending $200 million on a game, you were going to make a great game, and everybody else was toast. And at the same time, Mark was saying, hey, Epic just made a great game with a team of 45 25 people. Screw you, EA.
That sounds like Mark.
And that was delightful. But the most important question that came out at that talk was, are graphics good enough?
Yeah.
Right? And it's kind of the long, hey, when we got to 32-bit color was good enough, right? Right? And the funny thing is now, 20 years later, it's like, oh, HDR, by the way, right? So 32-bit color was not good enough as a note. But until you've got rendering power to uniquely render every single person in a stadium for a basketball game or a football game or a baseball game, you're not done. No. And one of the points that Mark had made at that talk was, when you walk into a restaurant and you want every single candle flame on every single table to look correct, right? So I would say from a performance standpoint, we're not done, right, on the hardware side. And developers still want more. Hollywood has the luxury of being able to render hours per frame kind of no matter what. And they can throw more hardware at it and do their thing.
You're stealing question 5, dude. Come on.
But we don't, So, I think that's where it's really kind of headed. And screens, I think, on phones are kind of settled in, for the size, and they're a little bit bigger than the tiny little things we started with. But now that people can have appreciation for graphics, I think now it's where the graphics need to continue.
So it's all about graphics now, Dave.
Ratcheting up.
Dave, it's all about graphics now, or do you think it's for you, Dave? Is it all about graphics now, or is it what's exciting you?
What's exciting me in terms of the evolution of the hardware, in terms of the evolution of games,
how you like.
So,
I was expecting you to not think that matters so much. To be honest.
So the thing that's really fascinated me in the last year, I started off my career in the 90s making edutainment, right? Making games on disk for kids to teach them to read and write and crush the SATs and so on. And in 2000, I moved into what I think of as my first true mass market gaming job, designing and producing games for Pogo on the web. And we had a pretty hard-coded formula that you needed to be able to do something very meaningful in 2 or 3 minutes, right? This was the play pattern we bought into. Now, one of the games I built there, WordWomp, had an average session length close to 2 hours, right? Because an average daily usage amount of close to 2 hours per user. Because people would play 2 minutes, and then they'd play again, and they'd play again, and they'd play again. But we had a really hardcore contract with that player that in 2 or 3 minutes, they could accomplish something meaningful. They could win, they could lose, they could earn some points, they could buff their account, and get out, right? Now, I don't think too many people were hauling their vintage 2000 laptops around in line at Starbucks, but, while the baby's napping or the water's boiling for the pasta or whatever. And that contract has really stayed intact in terms of what's been topping the charts on Facebook, on mobile, right? In terms of web engagement, that sort of 2 to 5 minute contract has really been core to that thesis. And this year, there were a bunch of products that really shattered my expectations around that, right? That really crushed. Obviously, Fortnite's a clear example. Lineage kind of offers you that, but really is better suited for a long experience. HQ, right, has really destroyed that play pattern model in a big way. And this is the first time that I've seen games on mobile really breaking through to the top of the charts and to sort of cultural awareness that have just completely discarded that model. And, for me, I'm a pragmatist. I tend to be a little bit backward looking. So for me, that was kind of a huge mind-blowing development in the last year.
I think that makes sense. So we kind of have to deal with that elephant in the room.
Okay.
So it's Fortnite.
Let's do it.
Ended it. So it's all over now. It's just all about Fortnite now, or is there?
Yeah, that's the only entertainment
in the world
platform for the future, for the entire world.
Let's talk a bit about it. In terms of why do you think it's obviously the game is a huge phenomenon generally, but why is it coming into mobile become really interesting?
Well, I have to of course clarify ahead of the time that I'm not on the Fortnite development team. I work on the engine side. But what I think you saw specifically specifically on the mobile platform, and the success of Fortnite on mobile was just those perfect time frames coming together of having a game that could be had an art style and an engine that supported a wide variety of quality levels that you could have more performance and more customization while maintaining the visual quality bar because of the art style. So that made it something that was obviously a lot easier to bring to a lower end performant platform. And just the game engines, again, not to toot our own horn, but the flexibility of being able to stand up a playable version. It took the team, once the decision was made, about 10 days to get a version running on high-end iOS. Now, that's not counting that's without the interface, touch interface, and things like that. But at that point, the team got the game up and running so fast that gave them the opportunity to really consider what they wanted to do with Fortnite on mobile. And that's when the big call was made, one game, one platform. Was because they could get it up and running so fast, then it was like, oh, now we can actually really do true cross-platform play here. Now how are we going to do it? And then, of course, a ton of work was put into getting it running smoothly because, it was very ambitious, 100-player multiplayer game with long engagement ranges and coming from Ghost Recon, I'm still quite impressed what what the team pulled off on that. That capability right off the bat really kind of set that goal to be doable.
And obviously, we've got an audience, I imagine, mostly of indie kind of scale developers. Are there lessons you think that these guys can take from the way that worked?
Well, definitely check out some of the keynotes that were done at GDC about the optimization that was done on mobile, and specifically, one of the big benefits that Epic has as being a game development company and a technology company is that, with a game like Fortnite, our teams are banging away developing actual products that are being shipped, developing features that can be used to support those games, and then those features are being rolled back into the engine that we're putting out to licensees. So, check out those things that you can put into your own games. But again, I think the key takeaway for me as a developer is really to think about, the platform as part of just a regular development pipeline. That while you're putting together your platform and you're thinking about how you're planning it, you're not thinking about multiple different projects. You're thinking about, well, this is what my PC version's going to look like on Steam or GOG. This is what my console version's going to look like when Microsoft comes knocking. This is what my mobile platform's going to look like. And it's all kind of living in one environment. And, that is going to set you up for success as an indie, because one of the things that you both can be and have to be is flexible. So when the market changes a little bit, when say a PC platform just floods the market and lets a bunch of people ship a bunch of stuff, or a new console comes out that's super, super popular and you want to shift, or maybe a high technology headset device doesn't do quite as well as you hoped it was going to do. You can be flexible and shift between those platforms if you think about it as more of you're making a global experience, and how you're going to tailor it to different platforms.
Yeah, that said, I think, indies still have to face those resource constraints in terms of how they want to sequence those, roll those out.
Definitely.
Epic has the resources to make that bet across a bunch of platforms all at the same time.
Yep.
Indies.
Yeah, but to me, it's less about I guess I'm not saying indies just go build a massive cross-platform.
Yeah.
I've made the mistake of an indie of trying to do 2 simultaneous platform launch, and it totally kicked our butts. But I think it's more of just thinking about structurally. One of the things that they did in Fortnite with the shift to mobile is the level of detail when it came to draw distance. Instead of starting at high max of this is what we want the scene to look like, and then culling down as far as we're going to cull these objects out of draw distance, they started at the lowest level, i.e. these are the objects we always need to be rendered inside all the time, and then we're going to add detail on top of that up moving the other direction. So all the QA testing was done on the lowest level of detail from a gameplay standpoint, so that the testing could call out of like, hey, when we, at the lowest level of detail, this thing's called out at 75 meters and players are trying to take cover behind it and it's called out at 75 meters. So that has to be rendered all the time. And then adding detail on top of that, I think that's, one example of how you could do that. But definitely, I'm not saying like try to maintain everything at the same time, but just think about, the future and think about how you structure your projects. Because there's no reason today that you can't make a mobile, experience or VR experience or PC experience, get really good player feedback, get really good reviews, take that learnings, and then maybe launch it to another platform that could be maybe even more popular building off, monetarily.
And I think we've seen a few.
I think what it comes down to for smaller teams is looking just far enough out so that when you're dealing with the task at hand, you're not preventing what might have been.
Yeah.
Right? Know what APIs are going to be there, know how high you might want to go, and now that I'm not at NVIDIA, I don't have to tell everybody, hey, start with the greatest best stuff, right?
Exactly.
And then dial back from there. In all of the years that I was at NVIDIA, every single really successful game, even on PC where there was a lot of hardware, the development team actually did exactly that. I mean, even with Unreal Tournament, it was step one, worry about the stuff that's important for gameplay. Step two, sprinkle the good stuff on afterwards.
Yeah,
right?
I think if we think back, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the physics cards. Like everybody's going to get physics cards, so let's all support physics cards. That didn't work out too well. So
No, exactly. I think what's interesting to me is that, again, obviously other engines do exist, but I mean, this mindset that, we actually need to make this gameplay experience work. And that if we find that the platform we originally chose is the wrong one or the market's moved, we can
pivot.
Yeah, having that ability is huge, especially for an indie. I mean, we've seen, with VR, it not reaching the goals that I think we all hoped it would reach as far as mass market penetration and the market viability, especially for indies, discoverability and things like that. So, I was just talking to a team a few weeks ago that was developing, has a really cool game that they announced at VRLA on VR, looks great, and I played it for about an hour, and I was like, there is no reason that you can't maintain a traditional flat screen experience with this game, and continue making the VR vision that you have, but just think about when you're making your menu option choices, when you're thinking about how you construct things, how can you pivot, like you said, to a flat screen experience. And
Build for an actual market.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think that's a really interesting point, and I'd like to explore that a bit further. Because obviously, we talked about something like Fortnite is massively kind of like demanding on the performance of the device, but then something at the other extreme, let's say a messenger-based game, maybe a lot lighter. Does that invalidate? Does that mean there are different strategies, different mechanisms, or is it just more straightforward that actually it's focusing on the gameplay? Do you have any kind of, David, do you have any views on the kind of the role, the rise of the messenger game? Is that something you think is going to continue? Does it have a reflection on where games are going, or is it just another thing?
So, I think messenger games have a role in the ecosystem. I think they're going to be with us for a while. I think given the kind of current platform stances and regulations, figuring out how we're going to make them really monetize is going to be a challenge. The retention tools right now available on the platform are pretty poor. Of the games that I've been working on as a consultant, messenger games tend to retain worse than just about anything else. I think we're also just at the beginning of really sort of understanding what the kind of gameplay that's going to flourish in the social context of messenger games is once you get beyond the obvious, let's play Battleship, I go, you go kind of paradigm. Designing for that kind of social with a whole variety of chat groups and people interacting and doing meaningful things, together in a game that isn't necessarily kind of async session-based multiplayer, but can still be meaningful and still advance the game in a cohesive way, I think is a thorny design challenge. But the platform has a long way to go to be viable. I joined a HTML5 game company in 2012. A little early early-o.
A little early.
I feel like instant messenger games are still a little early-o.
Obviously, AR, obviously, would your view on that, Bill? I mean, is it a similar principle, or is AR a different kettle of fish in terms of that kind of, new space that's being explored?
Yeah, I mean, so number one, I am not of the school of, VR was a failure, let's move on to AR, right? I mean, have to say I've been playing way too much of Beat Saber over the last couple of weeks. And the thing that is remarkable is that the concept of holding devices in front of you and wandering all over the place, doing AR everywhere, that really kind of needs to get out of our head a little bit. But the other goings-on in the AR space, I think, are pretty interesting. The social aspect, I think, of AR, when you can have, and the days of a bunch of people sitting in the living room playing Madden on the screen, right, I mean, that was community gaming back in the day. And I think the real promise of AR is to kind of bring that happening again, whether it's in a school cafeteria or a school dorm room, handful of people being able to contribute, and whether it's a board game on a table in front of all of them and things like that. I think that's great. Star Trek Bridge Crew on the VR side shows that VR can do community.
Yes.
Right? Which I think is also really exciting, right?
It's a bit limited, but in terms of what you can actually do, because I want to do different.
Yeah, but it's the promise of VR brought to life, right? Like, as soon as you see Star Trek Bridge Crew, and I have friends at Red Storm, so, but as soon as you see it, you know the promise. I get to be one of those 4 bridge crew officers doing what I think they do, and I think one of the challenges when we always seem to talk about VR and AR is because they both have reality in the title, that there's some kind of linked thing that, like, well, if VR isn't doing so great, we should pour our assets into AR, and you can't have both.
I'd go a bit further. I think the type of display and whether it's VR or AR are also completely separate.
Yeah.
I'm working on an AR game that happens to create a virtual world around you, but it's an AR viewed experience, not a VR view, not a goggle view experience. Right. And I think that's that. Even PlayStation Home is a virtual reality of sorts. So I think we've got so much mixed language going on. I think it's confusing everybody.
Well, I think the core difference for me is that the fundamental VR experience is supposed to immerse you in another world, and the fundamental AR experience is bringing that other world and immerse it into your world.
So this is what sort of puts me a little bit in the VR skeptic camp, right? As I look at the way that we have learned to consume media or tend to consume media over the last 30 years, in general, it has persistently gotten more social and less immersive, right? And this is true of the way we consume movies. It's true of the way we consume news. Honestly, when you think about the biggest mass markets, which are out there on mobile, it's true of the way we consume games, right? So VR is very much, the social's still a little clunky, the immersion is very, very high, and the isolation factor that goes along with that, at least kind of sensorially, right? Yeah. I'm in my own private world, leave me alone, I've got a big block in front of me. Really cuts it towards an aficionado audience. I think it's going to be very, very hard for that tech to become mass in the way that some other gaming technology
have. I have to say, because I was at VRLA last week, or the week before, just the experience of going into a VR conference showroom, it is so quiet and calm, and you have all these people just loving the experiences that they're having in the individual booths, compared to an experience like we have outside right now, where everybody's loud and everybody's talking, everybody's showing things on their phone to everybody, and that is just, it is a fundamentally different experience, and I think VR will continue to expand with different mixed reality and things like that, but I think that's what it's something that always frustrates me a little bit when everybody wants wants to talk to those things as if they're like intrinsically linked.
Yeah. Although, in defense of Star Trek Bridge Crew and Beat Saber, both of those are amazing spectator games.
They are, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if you had this room full of little 8-foot by 8-foot areas of people playing Star Trek Bridge Crew, it would not be quiet in
No,
here.
that's true, yes.
And even I know Eve Valkyrie is like gone now, but I loved that. I was literally fighting against other people I knew were in their goggles too.
Right.
And it was the first time I played a space shooter where I truly felt like I was in a spaceship. Right. I think it was an amazing experience, a genuinely amazing experience. And I think we invalidate the solo experience at our peril. But I suppose where I'm a bit kind of confused is I thought that we'd see more people looking at that as a way of saying, I'm a true gamer, whatever that means. And I don't think we saw that happen, did we? Do we have that kind of experience? We saw people sort of identifying that VR was a perfect, involved experience or anything like that. I don't think we did.
I think the thing that's still missing at this point is the kind of game for VR. I mean, you got to remember that at this point, none of the first parties on VR have actually invested, right?
True.
They were all kind of doing the, be really careful. Sony, in the case of Square Enix with Tomb Raider, was like, oh yeah, could you do a little VR-ish kind of thing to throw us a bone, kind of stuff. And as long as people are only throwing bones to VR, we are not going to see its full potential.
No, we're not.
Full stop. But going back to Star Trek Bridge Crew, et cetera, and the thing that's kind of interesting is I'm sure that there are a lot of development teams that are out there that looked at Bridge Crew, have said, oh, we could do better than that, we could fix this, we could fix that, but at this beat, they also don't want to be we don't want to be the also-ran of Star Trek Bridge Crew.
Yeah.
So I'm predicting and hoping that in about 12 months' time, the next thing of that ilk is going to show up, and bless their heart to be the first penguins in the water for Bridge Crew, right?
Yep.
But it's coming.
But so, do we think, or is it coming now? Do we think, my personal view is the immersion experience is so interesting and valuable that it'll get revisited and we'll see, less inconvenient ways to do it eventually. But are we, I remember, I think Rictello was talking about 2023 as his expected time frame for that kind of stuff. Do you guys have any kind of view on when that might come, or is it so far away it's too unpredictable?
No, I think 2023 is probably a conservative bet, right? But I would hope that by 2020, E3 2020, GDC 2020, we're going to start seeing a couple of interesting things, and it may be just in time for Sony to say, "Oh, we're going to give up," right?
Well, that's
but
normal
thank
sign,
God the
isn't
PC
it?
will still be in.
The moment Sony gives up, it's going to be a thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not bitter.
Shots fired.
PlayStation Home, anyone? Yeah, should have been the. I honestly think it should have been the menu system for the whole PSVR, but that's just me being egotistical. Sorry, like I said, not bitter. So let's move on a bit. Actually, just take me a little bit in terms of the whole idea of platform. I think what we've kind of said is that one of the questions we had was, does platform matter anymore? And I think we're kind of saying it does, but maybe not quite in the same way as it has traditionally. Is that a fair? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I would say that from a platform matters, the great case study of the moment is Switch. So Switch is basically a Shield TV, not bitter.
I'm with you on that.
Booyah!
We can get drunk on that later.
Yeah. Well, get some drinks in me to have a conversation about that one. But Switch is half the performance of Shield TV, but because the platform holder actually invested, wow, holy cow, right? And the argument that I had at NVIDIA was out of $1.6 billion a year in R&D, man, throw these developers a bone, for God's sake, to get some good content.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Do the Make Something Unreal contest again, right? The $1 million Make Something Unreal contest.
well, exactly, that sort of thing.
I'll quit and enter that one.
But I mean, Dave, you feel the same way? I mean, is platform so important, but in a different way, or do you think it's just the same problems returned and reframed?
No, I mean, I think platform still matters, right? I mean, I think there are still play patterns that I'd like to build on mobile that I don't think are going to be particularly relevant on console, right? I think that there's increased porosity. I think there's more acceptance. I work on a ton of idle games that do really well on mobile and on desktop and on web, and there's places to go across, right? We're seeing Fortnite come through. I don't know if something like HQ would feel as relevant on my PC, right? I'm super happy to have that on my mobile, pick it up wherever I am, right? Play the game together with my office mates that way. I think it still matters. I think it skews your play patterns, but like I said, the interesting thing to me over the last year is those cement walls are cracking a bit in a way that I really had not expected. And one of the things I'd actually love to delve into while we're here is to learn a little bit about whatever you guys know on the Unreal side about how folks are engaging with Fortnite differently on mobile than they are on desktop or console. I have some hypotheses that have to do with like middle school lunch breaks and things like that, but I'm very curious what you guys have learned about.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not boned up on the user data on that. I know it has crossed my eyes, but unfortunately, I'm not knowledgeable enough to speak on that today.
But I am fascinated by the way that that's been able to break through, right? It's a huge surprise to me. I had personally kind of discounted it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any, it's funny, people look back on these things, and you talk to everybody all the time when these things happen, and I always steal the line from George Miller, who I got to meet when I was working on Mad Max, and he had this line of, because you sit down with this person and you're trying to get your brain around, they went from Mad Max to Happy Feet, and then back to Mad Max, and how does that happen, and Babe the Pig, and you're like, that doesn't make any sense. And he said, I always look for the purple cow. I want my cow to be purple. I look across the field of black and white cows, and I'm only going to work on the purple cow. And even if it's the best looking black and white cow ever, I don't want to work on it. So when you see those happen, when you see the Minecrafts and the Angry Birds and these things happen, people want to go back and analyze it and say, oh, this is exactly how it's going to work, and this is how we can do it in the future. And if we could all do that, then we'd all be doing that. So there is a bit of luck, of course, sprinkled in there as well.
I think the other piece of planetary alignment that happened for Fortnite on mobile also, though, is that we are really kind of at the first time where performance and battery life for a performance game isn't going to kill you, right? I mean, independent of graphics quality, try running Fortnite on a device from 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Right?
And heat as well.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that comes from the users expecting. Users in general, especially younger users, are used to consuming traditional media on their phones. You have to have the battery power for them to sit down and watch 2 to 3 full-length movies on their phone, and they're used to doing that. And it's normal. When you get into your hotel room and they're like, oh, there's no Amazon on my TV. Well, I just watch it on my phone.
I do wonder how many guys playing Fortnite are sat there on their sofa next to their family with a massive battery plugged into their phone, though, because I'm sure that's the case. Yeah. So I think one last thing from you. Looking at we're a bunch of people who've been doing this sort of stuff for a long time. What's the one piece of advice you think you should give these guys for what's coming up in the future, particularly the next year or so? Who wants to go on? One bit of advice.
One bit of advice going forward. Well, especially for the indie and mobile devs, I mean, I think, I know it sounds hokey, but you need to have a fun gameplay experience. It's wonderful to look at all these monetization options. It's wonderful to look at Bitcoin and the opportunities of blockchain ownership and all these things. But the core aspect, regardless of the platform you're on, it needs to to be a fun, engaging experience. Now, what that means is really up to you, and can be tailored per platform. But if you're continually focusing on, well, I need this kind of monetization and this kind of engagement and this kind of return and this kind of social aspects, if it's not at its core a fun, engaging 2 to 3 minute loop, I would say gameplay loop, or app loop or whatever, if you don't have that core experience, then you're not going to be successful, no matter how wonderful the technology or the platform is that you're using. And it sounds pretty basic, but it seems to drop out of the conversation sometimes.
Bill.
Yeah. I mean, number one, I think that the experience, whether it's a movie, whether it's television, whether it's a game, it does come down to emotion, right? It was not lost on Ken Kutaragi to call it Project Emotion back in the day, right? And number two, from a business standpoint, the one really important thing to think about, and this is kind of touching back on the whole platform thing, what's interesting is that I did a little side trip in between Sony and NVIDIA doing Nuon interactive DVD players, right? And got to live through a consumer electronics battle between Sony and Toshiba and Sony Pictures and Warner Brothers, right? That's the other reason that I feel so innately that platforms are important, because you do have to remember that things like DVD and audio CDs and Blu-rays are platforms that are owned by consumer electronics manufacturers who unfairly also own studios and record labels, right? So money gets injected from the hardware guys, so never stop looking for money from hardware manufacturers, right? I mean, is really what it comes down to. And whether it's I can promote you and your hardware in my game, I think is a good, is kind of a good thing to keep in mind. And at the end of the day, if you are making a good game, those type of funding sources really are out there. And certainly if you can make the guy in finance and investments at NVIDIA fill in the other blanks, get into a game quickly and easily.
That's why I kind of like to think of hardware as DRM.
Yeah,
so we can get something out of it.
Yeah.
So, first of all, what these guys said, absolutely, 100% awesome advice. Your game has to be strong, it has to be fun. Think about your audience, think about people who love your game, and think about how you can validate as early as humanly possible. My saddest moment in game development, I was sitting in a bar at Austin Games Conference in 2008, and I ran into a guy who was on the Duke Nukem Forever team, and I asked him, how's it going? And he said, it's going great. We have everything in the game, now we just have to make it fun.
Yeah.
And my head hit the bar so hard. Understand the fun, validate your fun, talk to your users early, fail fast, pivot hard.
Yeah.
That's the way you get to something awesome without going broke.
Yeah. And remember, they did kill Duke Nukem Forever.
Thank God.
I used to love Duke Nukem. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much to the panel.